So every panel has had a massive theme, and this panel is no exception. And I appreciate the last panel for having started to tee up some of the democracy questions. I also wanted to thank Brandon for setting up the last panel with the observation that housing, health, education, and jobs are how most of us experience the economy most of the time. I think one of the things we're wrestling with in this conference is how to connect a kind of place-based understanding of economic realities, economic life, and economic possibilities with the sorts of levers that policymakers typically use at the macro level. I think that's one of the questions that's been thematized in this conference. Still a lot more progress to make on understanding it and, again, having analytical frameworks for it. But I think the questions are coming clearer. With regard to democratic institutions, yesterday as well, throughout the course of the day, we heard many people talk about the importance of rebalancing power in the economy. And rebalancing power in the economy is also about how we govern the economy, whether our democratic institutions can govern the economy for that broad purpose of general welfare, safety, and happiness, as opposed to a narrower objective function, as people were using that phrase yesterday. And so that means at the end of the day, questions of governance are fundamental to what kind of economy we have, how it operates, how we steer it. We're in a period of incredible flux in the governance institutions of the United States. And so on this panel, what we're going to do is start by exploring that flux, ask the question of just exactly how do our governance institutions operate at the moment, and then spend some time talking about where we think they should go. So I'm going to invite each panelist to start by sharing briefly their observations about what is the most important change in how U.S. democratic institutions are functioning right now, and then we'll pick up threads and we'll talk about the what we should do as well as the what is happening part. But I'll start. I forgot to introduce my panelists. Sorry. Apologies. Our first speaker will be Professor Jack Goldsmith, who's the Learned Hand Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, then Jen Palka, who's board chair for the Recoding America Fund, then Jed Britton-Purdy, Raphael Lemkin, Professor of Law at Duke Law School, Rashad Robinson, who is a social justice leader, strategist, and author, led Color of Change for many years in really powerful ways, and Julius Krein, editor of American Affairs. So, Jack.
Thank you, Danielle. Thanks for inviting me. So I don't know if it's the most important governance change or governance feature now, but one unusual aspect of the current state of affairs is that the separation of powers as it was hoped to work and as it worked for a long time is definitely not working now. By which I mean basically that the Congress is, with a few exceptions, out of the game, both in terms of lawmaking and in terms of oversight of the executive. This ebbs and flows a little bit depending on the political configuration of the Congress, but that's basically been true for a while now. As a result, the executive branch, even before we get to President Trump, comes into office and feels enormous pressure and has made promises to get things done. So presidents have been asserting broader and broader assertions of power based on both their own powers and on vague delegations from Congress. And so we've had more and more policy making, and including hugely wrenching, consequential policy making happening at the executive branch level. And then the courts decide whether the president can do that or not. So basically governance gets done in terms of policy making by a dialogue between the executive branch and the judiciary, which is certainly not the way it was meant to be done. And then the last thing I'll say briefly, and we can talk about this more if you like, another very important governance change is the rise of the unitary executive, which I'm sure you've all heard of. The unitary executive did not begin in the Trump administration. It didn't even really begin in the Reagan administration, as you may have heard. Basically, every president since Washington has embraced some version of the unitary executive, and let me just say what that means. The unitary executive is basically the idea that the actions of the executive branch, all of the executive branch, are the president's actions. As the Supreme Court put it recently, the president is the only person who is a branch of government. And what that means is that the president is able, through directing executive branch officials and firing executive branch officials to control them. This is a theory that has been building in the case law for a while, and it is definitely true that President Trump in this administration, not in his first term, is taking it to new extremes. There was an important argument in the Supreme Court on Monday that's going to validate some of what he's been doing. So without speaking any longer, I'll just say that this idea of absolute vertical control of the presidency is going to be a feature of the presidency going forward.
Thanks, Jen.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I think you'll see some ties between Jack's comments and mine. The thing that I want to talk about is not new. It's been happening for a very long time. But I do think it's sort of risen to the level of crisis, and it's a crisis of state capacity. And you don't see headlines about the crisis of state capacity, but I do think you see it in things like polling where 70% of the public says we should either have major change to the system or blow it all up. They may not know that they are talking about state capacity, but I think in part they are there. So state capacity, as you know, is just the ability of a government to achieve its policy goals. I would add to that within a relevant time frame. And we don't have, is relevant not just to the problem that you're trying to solve. So if you are trying to combat climate change, but it takes 17 years through a fast track process to get a wind farm online, well, you have 17 years of those emissions, for instance, that you can't really put back in the bottle. I mean, a lot of people would like to be, maybe we can put them back in the bottle. But it also has to be relevant to the feedback loops that are supposed to drive our democracy. Brian Scheer recently pointed out that it takes 5 years to promulgate a regulation. I won't bore you with all the steps. Many of you have had this lovely task of coming up with something, collecting the data, proposing the rule, finalizing the rule, all this. Yes, if it's 5 years, then you really cannot have a president who runs on a particular promise and delivers that promise within a time frame that provides the ability to give feedback on his or her performance, and then add in challenges from the courts, as Jack was talking about. That can easily be 8 years. So we really don't have feedback loops that are relevant. And this is even worse in the service delivery side of government. I came into the state of California during the pandemic to help clear the backlog of unemployment insurance claims, and they said, oh, by the way, this is all going to be fine soon because we have a business system modernization RFP coming out, and when we get the new system, it'll all work. And we said, well, you can't put that out right now. And they said, oh, no, we have to. It's been in development for 11 years. So it's time we get that out on the street. And let me be clear, they were not building it for 11 years. They were gathering requirements and writing an RFP for 11 years that would then spend probably 2 years on the street and then another 10 years to develop. So you're talking about like what, 20, someone do the math, 23 years? This is not responsive to, this is not in sync with the responsiveness that we need. So briefly, like how did we get there? It's not, I think, controversial to say that our operating model in government is essentially left over from the industrial era. We say we have an internet era government, but like we just slapped some websites on the front end and left the back end very much as it was in sort of post-war into the 70s in how it actually functions. But also because we have created a machine for adding rules and procedure, and it's not very good at subtracting those things. So when I did the unemployment insurance thing to continue with that example, every governor in the country was blaming the COBOL code that is in these unemployment insurance systems in the states. I guarantee you the COBOL code was great. It worked fine. It was churning out checks like you would not believe at like 10x the rate. It was where it was people who got caught in the system that couldn't leverage the COBOL code. The real problem is that, I don't know the number for California, but in New Jersey they did the work. It's the number of pages of regulations that govern this program is 7,119. You can't have a scalable, robust system that can suddenly serve 10 to 15 times the number of people who need it if it is that regulatorily complex. we really have to grapple with that. So just briefly, where is this going next? Well, you see signs of taking this sort of speed issue really critically in things like Josh Shapiro getting the 995 back up in, I think it was 11 days. And also, frankly, I think you see speed being a real characteristic of the Trump administration's approach to things. They're also, frankly, as frustrated as other administrations about how hard it is and how slow it is to do this stuff, though I don't think they have really gone at those volumes of regulation in the way that was sort of promised in the beginning of the administration. And so that work of building a machine that either subtracts or sort of rationalizes is yet to be done, and I think that's the agenda.
Okay, so just to observe really quickly, what we've just mapped out for you the constitutional order, right? Will of the people through Congress doesn't operate any longer. Instead, you have a unitary executive that gives us a kind of arbitrary experience of whiplash. I'm editorializing, but Jack didn't say that, I said that. Then you have a problem of lack of speed and actually ability to get stuff done and the implementing arms of the federal government. The judiciary comes in and is sort of, in a funny way, substituting for what the will of the people should have been through Congress in terms of deciding what policy is viable or not. So think, 1786, Annapolis Convention, people are frustrated, like what are they putting on the table? Okay, this is the same sort of set of frustrations that we're putting on the table about our own moment of governance. I think now what we're gonna also sort of talk about is issues of public opinion and public dissatisfaction, and there's a relationship between the kind of erosion of the functioning of the constitutional order and then what we're seeing in popular politics. But Jed?
Yes, I'm going to talk a little about political culture and specifically about political trust as an aspect, as a predicate, really, of democracy. So some of the themes that have emerged in the conference so far, industrial policy, the decommodification or taking off market of the way we address some key human needs, securing dignity and power in the workplace, securing time for care and the care economy. These have in common that they increase the stakes of politics. They increase the load on politics. So the question I want to pose is whether we have a politics that can carry that load. And I want to focus on that question specifically in the dimension of trust. In democratic politics, we put ourselves very intensely in one another's hands, because that politics, when it succeeds, determines the terms of common life, determines how public power will be deployed, and sets the direction of travel toward the future. Generally speaking, when we put ourselves in one another's hands for purposes of one kind of social cooperation or another, trust is the attitude that enables us to do it, to put ourselves forward and so to put ourselves in one another's hands in a way that goes beyond what we can be sure of, that makes us vulnerable to defection or betrayal, but where it succeeds, lets us do things that we couldn't otherwise do. This, I think, is also true of democratic self-government. If we do not trust one another to govern in good faith in a way that shows due respect for our core intentions and interests, views and interests, and do not, at a deeper level, regard ourselves as being in some sense in it together, then it is very difficult to get people to stand still for sweeping, deep, dangerous feeling changes to the ways that we do things. And yet each of the changes that we've been describing can and reliably will be made to seem dangerous and partisan in polarized terms. So if the core question here is, do we trust one another as majorities of co-citizens and in the institutions in which they govern through representation enough to envisage and bring about some of the kinds of changes that we're talking about? There's a lot of reason, and I won't go through the numbers, to think that the answer might be not enough. And a basic fact about contemporary politics is that politically engaged citizens reflexively take the view and are trained to take the view that for the other side to hold power is basically unacceptable and a kind of existential political threat. It's a basic fact about contemporary politics that narratives about what we are living through and whether it is constitutional success, constitutional threat, or constitutional disaster divide us and organize us in very deep ways that don't add up to majorities. Let me try to anchor this thought, and I am not sure of my own thinking about any of this. I'm trying to put it a bit polemically because I think it's something that those of us who want to reinvigorate democracy and increase its remit need to take seriously as a potential kind of bottleneck on the actual capacity of ongoing self-government. But let me try to anchor this in our theme of political economy. How do we learn not to trust? There are lots of views on this. Some say liberalism makes us untrusting and untrustworthy. Some say diversity makes us untrusting and untrustworthy. Many say the other side just can't be trusted. I want to talk just a bit about how the economy socializes us to regard one another at 3 registers, each of which has been sounded here. The first is the everyday activity of the real economy. In an economy that is more and more engineered at a fine-grained level to maximize profit-taking and to shape our everyday interactions accordingly. So we ask ourselves, if we're not fools, we ask ourselves, is this MRI being recommended because the hospital is now owned by private equity? Is the reason I couldn't get behavioral care for my kid at the hospital because it's now owned by private equity? Is the price I'm seeing really the price, or is it a surveillance-based, bespoke price discrimination price? And at a deeper level, if I can't get a house when I'm 35 years old and working, is there a social compact? Is there a sense in which the system is one that deserves my basic trust, or is the correct attitude alienated and, let's just say alienated one? Okay, second, is the online world. It's the economy of representation in a fragmented and targeted media world. I can't much improve on what Graham Burnett said yesterday, so I'll just say very briefly that we learn how to regard ourselves and one another in a mediated way. We always have, but that's increasingly online. It's increasingly differentiated. We know the generations that are most immersed in this and native to this are the least trusting in terms of all the surveys, and we know that the way you hold attention online, which is how you commodify attention, is by presenting people with threat and occasion for outrage. And we know that dominating and aggressive forms of behavior online are rewarded in a way that they are not in real life, which more than training people in that, trains people in how other people are and tells them that they are risky and not to be trusted. Third, and this is farthest flung, and then I'll stop, neoliberalism, among other things, if we want to keep using the term, is a form of public rationality. It is a version of what kinds of arguments make sense and how to make them, and what kinds of arguments don't make sense. And as such, it's also a way of being a person among people. If the presumption of everyday interactions is that no one wants to leave anything on the table and that everyone must be trying to get something out of the interaction because otherwise why would they be bothering? Then there's, if you will, a kind of phenomenological level in which suspicion is the default mode of the sensible person. So in short, we deal with a situation in which, as is often said, our politics is in some sense downstream of our culture. However, our culture is in some sense downstream of our political economy. And the premise that brings many of us together, our political economy is downstream of our politics and the result of a series of more or less intended choices about how we're going to live together. So how do we find ways to intervene in what's actually not a stream, but a loop, and which may be a dysfunctional loop, is the question.
Also known as a vicious circle. Rashad.
Yes. As someone who sort of has worked in the space of civil rights at the intersection of, narrative and culture and technology, I wrestle with sort of how we go forward, because I so often have to wrestle with the story that we tell about the past. And, when I was co-chairing the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, regularly we would be sort of among, commissioners from, who represented some version of the right, not the MAGA right, but some version of the right, and folks that represented some version of the left, with all the sort of diversity features that you would expect in a space like this. And people would opine about sort of the good old days of media, the good old days of information sharing. And they would be folks who, were very, visible in media during the era of the AIDS epidemic of the 80s. And you could pull up their reporting that they did during that era and ask them, what were the incentive structures that sort of led to this type of reporting? What was leading to that type of reporting? There were not a lot of folks that did the reporting and storytelling during the sort of civil rights movement of the 60s. But if you go back to that era and the incentive structures of that, and so I think if you just look at media as sort of one lens, the story that gets told, the incentive structures, the sort of profiteering of, and now, yes, we overlay technology to that. That makes everything move much more quicker. That means that there's a lot more sort of dollars at stake. But I think that the sort of preservationist stream that kind of exists in both the left and the right? That if we just overlay technology to sort of the civil rights kind of things, we can go back to those old civil rights protections and we just overlay the technology in the new world. You look at online on the right and you see the sort of trad wife trend online, and you see folks using technology in all sorts of ways to sort of want to go back to a different day. And I think that desire sort of comes up against like the very real way that we have to come together and live together under a system that is just, I don't know how much it's designed for any of our ability to be able to express our will for a better future, regardless of whether you're privileged or vulnerable, in the majority or minority, or in favor or out of favor with those in power. And, Danielle, I know you do a lot of work around alternative voting systems, but how do we get to alternative voting systems from the place that we're at? How do we build the type of momentum and energy? And I do keep coming back in all of these conversations to the role of the sort of institutions that bring people together to fight for a better tomorrow, whether on the left or the right, or whether they're representing particular interest groups or representing particular issues. And I continue to sort of wrestle with sort of how do we get from the point that we're at right now to the next point, given sort of this deep desire to go back, and given all the ways in which the profiteering is so incredibly strong, and our ability to sort of break that, I don't see sort of a path forward. The sort of, other thing I will just say about sort of the era that we're currently in, I don't think it can be explained through a academic theory. It's chaotic, it's deal making, it is, what we're seeing in Washington doesn't represent a clear framework of anything that I've ever seen or any one thing that can be explained. One minute, there's deal making on this side, another minute there's deal making on that side, and the sort of profiteering and the sort of interest of staying on the side of the person in charge means that sort of day in and day out, we can't explain it through an academic theory. And I do think that unless we're sort of building new ways to think about how we're leveraging power and how we are making the things that we care about in terms of addressing the challenges popular in ways, we're going to continue to face what we're facing.
Thanks, Rashad. Yeah, Julius?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to more of the economic side of political economy. The most significant change I've seen in the last 5-10 years is actually the American business sector actually desiring state capacity, desiring a government to do things, mainly driven by the increasing capital intensity and energy intensity of the new AI growth models, and also some of the reindustrialization and supply chain resiliency things that are happening. I think in the past, the fact that it would take the government 20 years to do anything would have been seen as excellent, working as designed by the corporate sector. But now you have people that want to build a nuclear power plant, want to figure out the issues with the natural gas turbine supply chain, and so on and so on, needing huge amounts of capital to make investments that governments inevitably have to play a role, or they want government to play a role in some way. Those of you who have heard me speak at these conferences in the past, I would, my favorite talking point was usually, if you go back to the 1950s, the most profitable companies were the largest investors and largest employers. In the neoliberal era, the most profitable companies, mainly tech and finance, had outsourced and offshored the capital-intensive parts of their supply chain and had very little need to reinvest capital. And now, actually, we are back to the most profitable companies being the largest investors again. I'm not, that trajectory, I think there are questions about the sustainability of the current trajectory, but it's nevertheless a profound shift, and it has massive implications for politics. I think on the Democratic side, the model was always, neoliberal Democrats were the market's most important, but we're going to kind of layer in technocracy and moralism. And on the Republican side, it was actually, get rid of all of it, drown the state in the bathtub. And now you actually, have, the Democratic side is not particularly useful in this current environment, I would say. And the Republican side, they're scrambling really to figure out what to do. It took decades to get here. They haven't trained, they haven't cultivated this expertise, people to do this kind of policy. It's going to take decades to solve that. There's also a lot of questions about how much of this is idiosyncratic to Trump personally, how much of it is structural. I don't have an answer to that, but I think a profound shift in political economy is taking place, and it will continue to be very fractious and chaotic, for the foreseeable future.
Great. No, thank you so much for those diagnoses. And so a couple of important themes came out of that. Institutions and culture are two parts of a system for how governance operates. And they're interactive with each other. So that's one of the challenges. Also, the economy and the political system are in a mutually reinforcing loop, and it can either be, sort of in a downward spiral where it is, the economy is extractive and reducing experiences of well-being, and governance, I think in that context is also becoming more disconnected from the people, more autocratic. I mean, we want instead a sort of positive reinforcing equilibrium and a sort of virtuous cycle. And I think we can hear how we're stuck, right? We can all hear how we're stuck. And it's sort of one of the themes of the conference. I want to go back to something that came up in the first panel yesterday. There was a sort of really interesting moment between Heather Boucher and Jason Furman, with Kadeem also weighing in, where Jason observed that the policy that had the multi-billion-dollar effect on children in poverty was not the one that people cared about, but the policy that had an effect on college graduates at a much lower level was the one that was politically viable. And Heather sort of asked a question along the lines of, but if people don't want it, even if we experts may think it's good, but should we do it if people don't want it? And Kadeem, at the same time, I don't know if folks sort of saw the connection here, but was sort of making the point about translators between experts and the general public. And I think that kind of moment between Jason and Heather was really a moment of just clear recognition of the separation between experts and the general public. And maybe the answer is not like, we think it and they don't think it, but rather a story about how are we doing the translating and connecting anyway. And that's really the democracy story that's here. And so I want to now sort of bring us to the what should we do question, and then our last question will be, and how should we try to do it? But on this sort of what should we do question, Jack, I'm going to come back to you because My own view is that it's not okay that we have maximalist unitary executive, and that we shouldn't sort of accept that as a thing for the foreseeable future. I think legislative supremacy matters. I think it matters both at the federal level and the state level. And by legislative supremacy, what I mean is that the will of the people is genuinely being channeled through a legislature. That means legislatures have to actually function. And that is, it's precisely because that's not happening that we have this huge disconnect between experts and the people at this point. So I guess my question for you is, I know you also have a respect for the founding and sort of importance of legislative supremacy in that context. I mean, is that a crazy idea to think that we could get back to meaningful legislative supremacy?
Can you just say a few more words about what you mean about legislative supremacy?
Sure.
You mean Congress taking the lead in policymaking, essentially?
I do, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So first thing these are hard questions.
The only good kind.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is there's not a contradiction or even necessarily a tension between a strong vertical unitary executive and legislative supremacy. And let me just explain what I mean by that. David French actually made this point this morning in his conversation with Emily Bazelon in the New York Times. And I think it's an important possibility. And that is the Supreme Court has been facilitating this vertical control of the executive. And under the current regime, the more power the president has vertically, the more he can use these broad delegations from Congress, where Congress hasn't legislated in decades and decades, and do what he wants. But there's reason to think that the court is at the same time it's going to enhance this vertical control. It's going to go back to a very old-fashioned conception of separation of powers, where the president can't, even if he has this vertical control over the bureaucracy, he can't rely on these broad delegations from Congress. In other words, the president would be disabled from doing things like Trump did in the tariff case. I believe the tariff case is going to go down. I believe that it's going to be a hugely important decision for limitations on presidential power. This has nothing to do with the unitary executive and everything to do with how aggressive can the president be in relying on old statutes. If that happens, and if the court has been serious about that in other contexts, and if it shows that it's serious about that here, then the unitary executive can control the executive, but there's only so much it can do on the issues you care about in terms of regulating, changing the legal and policy landscape. That would incentivize the president, if this happens, to have to go back to Congress more than the president is doing now. That would be part of the problem now is Congress doesn't want to act for a whole bunch of reasons having to do with its focus, the way it's organized. It's terribly organized to achieve policy aims. It's focused on re-election. It prefers to have the president decide as a general matter. But if the president can't get things done and has to go back to Congress, then that would incentivize a dialogue that we don't currently have. And all the incentives that the president has to make policy changes and to achieve results would require going to Congress. Now, I think that's one set of incentive changes that the current conservative Supreme Court is moving towards. I think it's useful. I think it takes us back to the founding vision. I'm not saying it's a panacea. I'm not saying it's going to reinvigorate Congress. To really reinvigorate Congress in the way I think you're envisioning, you'd have to do more than that, including changing the way the parties are organized, changing the way campaigns are financed, changing the way Congress is organized inside the Congress. But I just want to emphasize that the unitary executive is not inconsistent with legislative supremacy in that sense.
That's really helpful. I appreciate it, Jack. So now I'm going to come to Julius and Jen and ask you both. Julius, you just named the way in which, given the sort of post-neoliberal picture of the economy that's developing from a lot of different points, where there is an interest in direction-setting policy that can shape the economy towards substantive outcomes that we want other than simply profit. For both of you, and then Jen, for you, this is going to be a question about Congress. Can you see Congress doing this job? I mean, Jen, you've described the way in which sort of extensive requirements and protections that Congress establishes is part of what slows down the whole process of actually delivering policy. one of the key principles for the design of the institutions at the founding was that they should have energy, in the sense of that being able to get things done, that speed and so forth. And so for both Julius and Jen, I mean, can you imagine a world where Congress could get itself energetic and actually delivering if the popular conversation were helping to clarify direction? Julius first, and then Jen.
Yeah, Jack's comments actually give me a certain optimism because in my experience and for the issues that I care about, which mainly involve industrial policy, the obstacle to Congress isn't polarization or a lack of bipartisanship or anything like that. It feels very idiosyncratic in that this administration has simply decided, for reasons inexplicable to me, not to actually engage with Congress much at all. And I think in the first Trump administration, Congress did have a separate agenda under Paul Ryan and so on. This time around, they actually don't. They're waiting for the White House to tell them what to do, and 80% of the time they would do it. But the White House actually just doesn't do that. So I don't actually see Congress as that much of an obstacle. I think that there's a lot of interest, from broader constituencies in using Congress to cement policies, prevent this kind of whiplash effect. I mean, a funny anecdote for you, I was talking with a major investor the other day who said, all this stuff is really interesting, but if the Democrats win, won't industrial policy go away? Which made me chuckle. But I think there is a lot of, no one has figured out the model for how to use Congress. And there's a lot of, messaging bills in Congress today basically mean you just put something out there that has no chance of passing. It doesn't provoke a debate. It doesn't matter at all. I think there is an opportunity, particularly, when we have these big ambitious things happening, but not much of a coherent strategic framework, where Congress could actually take the lead in introducing a serious piece of legislation, which even if it doesn't pass, it forces people to think about, kind of in a larger strategic view. Thus far, they have not done that. I wouldn't say that's out of the question. I think that some might be moving in that direction a little bit, and I think if some of the things that Jack was talking about happen, that might actually be a very, very good incentive. It'd be the one positive incentive counteracting against some of the media and other stuff.
Jen, before you jump in, I just want to make one observation. I think the whiplash point is really important, and it connects to the comments Matt Stoller was offering yesterday about the problem of arbitrary coercion. I mean, whiplash is what arbitrary coercion feels like, and unfreedom, I would say, is whiplash is what unfreedom feels like as well. And so that's where the sort of legislative supremacy concept comes from, the idea that you have a body that's communicating the voices of the people coming from so many different places, synthesizing them and smoothing out decision-making over time and making it durable and sustainable, and you avoid that whiplash. That is like the experience of freedom, basically, sort of free self-government. So just wanting to sort of observe that, the question about Congress is partly a question about getting stuff done and energy, but it's actually also a question of what, again, in the sort of founding discussions, they called Republican safety. That is, that protection from arbitrary coercion. So I think these are the things that are at stake in whether or not Congress is functional. But Jen, Congress has been so dysfunctional from so many of the things you've looked at. Like, what hope is there?
Well, I can't resist commenting on that comment as well. I mean, arbitrary is a great a common characteristic of sort of so many interactions that we have with government. If you bring someone in to, look at your plans for remodeling your house, like one inspector will say one thing and the other. You don't really know if you're, qualified for this benefit, and different people say different things, and it's just that complexity. So I just tying that together. But I strongly agree with with Julius, and will add on to his sort of mystery about it. Why has the Trump administration not been more interested in going to Congress for things? And my interest in what they could go to Congress for is more in what we call the how instead of the what. So the guts of government stuff that they could have been interested in. I will, of course, note that we are less than 1 year into the administration, and at least the first 6 months of that, in my world, was very dominated by Elon Musk, who is now gone. And so there may be appetite for these things, but it is a just absolute non sequitur that they didn't. Well, you can explain it, but like, if you were going to try to cut the federal workforce, it would make it, and you had you had a trifecta. It makes a lot of sense to go and say, can we change the rules that govern reductions in force to allow for layoffs to hit poor performers before you go do that, if that's what you want. If you want a healthy administrative state that can do all the things that Julius was saying our businesses want, and they didn't do that. But they might still, and it would be things like civil service reform, which we haven't done since 1978, reform of the Paperwork Reduction Act, which is from 1980, which I'm sorry, I've broken a rule of mine. I always call it the comically misnamed Paperwork Reduction Act because it has exploded the amount of paperwork that we have to do in government. There is interest in Congress in this now, or the APA, or the Privacy Act from 1974. A law from 1974 governs how we deal with privacy and data in government services. That does not make sense. None of this stuff is the kind of thing that I think the average American thinks of when they say, oh, they wish Congress would legislate, they wish we had that energy. But it is absolutely long overdue, and we need that energy in this sort of guts, the how kind of work. And I actually think that we may about to be entering a period where there is that energy on my nerdy crap.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the sort of themes here is that we need a governance vision for whatever political economy vision there is, and we're seeing the sort of places where there's work to be done. Jack, you wanted to come in on this question about the White House and Congress.
I think the reason they've gone to Congress for a few things that they really care about: enhancing the power of ICE, cutting taxes. There's lots of goodies in the upcoming National Defense Authorization Act that they care about. But for the most part, I believe they don't really care about governance very much. They don't really care about policy very much. They're not really very good at governance. It takes a lot of work to work something through Congress, especially with such slim majorities in the House. And for example, it's the civil service stuff. A lot of immigration reforms would have helped them if they really wanted to enhance deportation. They didn't bother. The ICE thing is, I think so two things I think explain it in addition to those. One is they think they can get things done faster and better by pure executive power and that the courts are going to go along. And two, this is a really important point, they don't care about legal structures as much as they do changing the politics. The in terrorem effect of their immigration policy and their incapacitation policy inside the government has been much more effective, they think, and will have long-term effects, much more so than changes in law. So I just think they don't think about governance the way it's been traditionally thought about, and I don't think they care much about it.
Can I comment on that briefly? Yes, I agree with that. And you had Elon and his folks come in at Doge. They are now gone, but their people are left, and they're doing exactly what people in my generation who came into the Obama administration did, which is learning. They are learning that they cannot get what they want to get done if we don't change the PRA and the Privacy Act and the APA and all of these things. And I wonder if they will start to have a voice. I would think of that crew as sort of somewhat distinct from the folks that you're talking about who are largely OMBers.
A lot of those have given up. I mean, there's still
Yeah,
people there, I agree, but a lot of them have given up.
I completely
they couldn't
agree.
make it work.
But I think there are 8 new agency CIOs who largely come from the private sector, expect to be able to ship software, for example, and are pissed.
Great. No, thank you. That was a really helpful exchange. And now I want to bring in the other piece, which is the people again. And so I want to come to Rashad and Jed. And I have in the back of my mind as I'm asking these questions, Lincoln's phrase from the end of the Gettysburg Address, that government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. And the basic argument of that phrase is that you only get government for the people if it's also by the people. So this entire conference has in some sense been about how do we have a political economy that is actually for the people, as opposed to being for corporate profits, et cetera. At the end of the day, it's hard for me to see that as being anything other than a democracy question, that you have to have government that's meaningfully by the people. And so we can talk about the sort of design of our institutions and how they might be a better instrument of the people, but fundamentally it's a sort of the by the people question. And so I want to come back to Rashad and Jed to really bring that in. And Rashad, you mentioned alternative voting systems. People are experimenting with things like citizens' assemblies. I mean, and you have done a lot of work in movement politics in particular. You know, some folks think we need to change the access to the institutions. Some people think we need to build solidarities and coalitions. Can you kind of give us your assessment of like, how do we get back to sort of the by the people part of this? And then Jed, would love to have you come back in on the questions of trust and how that connects.
Yeah, I mean, in the last panel, Felicia talked a bit about sort of the listening, right? I think a lot of the ways that we make sense of what people want is through asking a series of questions and then saying, well, these are the top issues that people want. When I was at Color of Change, we had a membership of, 6+ million people, and we would survey our members a couple of times a year. And every time we would survey the members, the top issue that folks would say, majority black folks and then allies who want to stand with black folks of other races would say the top issue was the economy and education. They would always be the top issues. However, anytime we would want people to take action every year, and we would look at the action rates on various issues at the end of the year, they would be on killing of an unarmed black person or something that someone said that was racist in the media and they weren't being held accountable. And those were the things that far sort of took the sort of energy and engagement, not just signing petitions, but people willing to give money, take further and deeper action. And so sometimes the firms that we would bring in to kind of help us analyze that data would be like, well, actually, the folks actually care more about police accountability, and you should actually do more work on police accountability and media accountability, not education and economy, because those are the real issues. But I think we have a real problem with meaning and motivation. What actually drives people to sort of take action? What drives people to get out of their seats, to want to do something? And I came to the conclusion that it was none of those issues, that it was that people were living in a world that they felt like wasn't on their side, that they felt like that they couldn't get ahead and that they were being disregarded. And yes, education and the economy could help them get ahead. And they were most animated when they saw someone that looked like them or a family member of theirs being killed and nothing being done, or someone being able to disregard them through language and not being held accountable. And that could animate their action. And so what people are willing to get out their seats on and take action around may be very different than what they say in a poll. And that's important. It's important because we can go through a list of issues that we all care about, but unless we can build the will of people that are willing to fight for it, also the will of people that are willing to fight against all of the barriers that are going to stand in the way. For the first 3 years of the Biden administration, I would have a conversation with domestic policy and public engagement. And, they do this with a lot of civil rights leaders to make sure that we say nice things afterwards. And I would say, you have to explain to people why you're not any closer on George Floyd and Policing Act, or you're not any closer on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or any of the other things that actually that were part of the compact you had with black communities, and particularly black men in a lot of places coming out of 2020. That got people in a pandemic to show up, and you saw surges in voter turnout. And you need to actually explain a story that isn't just about Republicans and Democrats, but you have to explain a story about who is standing in the way of this and what you're going to do about it. And I think we're not telling a full story that creates meaning and motivation. And the final thing, I'll just say that about the sort of people is something else that Felicia said in the last panel as well, was about the New York City election. And all of the polling said that public safety was the issue, that public safety was the thing that people in New York City cared about. Yet the election, and now everyone on the left and on the right is now talking about affordability. But if you looked at just the polling, the list of things, and underneath that was this idea that people didn't trust the government in New York to do anything about affordability. They didn't think that affordability could be something that could actually be addressed by the government. And so both sort of in terms of what people trust the government to be able to do and address, what people are willing to sort of fight for and move on, what people are willing to understand about why things are not happening and who's to blame for that, and how do we push people towards taking on profiteers and other barriers to social change is going to be, I think, incredibly important to make any of the things that I think could move us from sort of the list of things we think will make things better to actually implementing them and being able to have the power to enforce the wins that we make. Like, that is movement building, that is power, but that means that we have to think, I think, very differently about how we approach people, and we have to think very differently about how we listen to people and how we think about what they're saying to us.
Thanks, Jed.
Great. So in thinking about political trust, there are a couple of, I think, small but important registers, and then one bigger one. Small, I think everything the Biden administration did to try to push back small ripoffs in the economy and make the everyday experience of economic life safer is a good kind of move, socializes people in a somewhat different way. I think actual juries and citizen juries and so on, any case where we get in the habit of deliberating and voting with consequences and then living with the consequences and finding out that that works, is excellent, and there's nothing like the habits of liberty to make people more comfortable with the hazards of being free, so that's awesome. That is also why political process reform is valuable besides what it gets us, which is that it enables us to do that and learn that actually we can do that, to get those muscles engaged again. But the bigger register, just quickly to come back to the themes of this conference, I personally would continue to gamble on something like the following, that there continues to be the potential in the country for a majoritarian working class and middle class politics of this form. And let me step back, then come forward. And stepping back, when people think about being in it together, having something really in common that they're committed to and that they're willing to take risks for, one way to voice that is the idea of living in a free society or a decent society, at least decent in potential and free in part. And what we tend to mean concretely by that is that there are certain kinds of fear that we don't have to live with acutely. Fear about how the government is going to put its hands on you in criminal process, though it's not true often enough. Fear about what your retirement is going to be like, or what happens when you lose a job. And it seems to me that if we go back to the erosion of the feeling that there's a compact and you're in it, and that you are part of a give and take with enough reciprocity that it makes sense to stay in it, keep believing in it, keep working in it, and stand still for the decisions of fellow citizens. The kind of expansion and enrichment of that anti-fear conception of a free society is a politics that actually has enormous potential. So here we come to what we get out of politics for one another. Imagine a politics where when someone gets sick, what you're afraid of is the sickness and not the economic catastrophe that follows. That when you go to work, you might be afraid that you're not doing a good job, but you're not afraid of arbitrary firing or manipulation. When or where you imagine or take for granted that the place where you grew up is a place where you could live and have a decent life if you chose to do so, and where you feel at home in your culture when you walk outside and are not afraid of what's going to happen when your child encounters your culture or when your culture comes into your household and finds your child, as Brad Littlejohn was saying yesterday. Those, I think, are some of the elements of a compact for a freer society. They're available only through democratic action. And if there's no way to do democracy but to do it, and if we do democracy by and large in good part because of what it gets us together and not only because it's good to do, and I think both of those things are true, then this is, I think, one way of thinking about how a democratic and a political economy agenda might dovetail.
All right, thank you very much for that. Appreciate that. I want to just observe, this is a small point of observation, but on the sort of issue of listening and sense making, that we do have lots of opportunities now. I mean, this is a place where technology is beneficial. AI sense making means we don't just have to use surveys. We can let people use natural language to communicate what they care about and actually learn a heck of a lot more about the sort of shape of popular hopes, fears, et cetera. So just a tiny point. Next 10 minutes are really going to be for your questions, so please do use the Slido. I'm going to start pulling in a couple of the questions that are here, but would welcome you to add other questions. One question came in about vicious cycles and how we get out of them. I'm going to invite folks to share thoughts about that. I want to observe before you do. I've been sitting here these whole couple of days trying to think about how different actors are situated. You know, we had a first panel where we had high-level economic policymakers, for example. We've had other people who are real place makers or community makers, and other categories as well. And everybody's work is contributing to the overall structure of our political economy. Sort of how does care fit in? What kinds of jobs are available for people? You can affect those things from either position. So I'd love to ask each of you to think about, to get out of the vicious cycles that we're seeing, what's one lever you would hope we could move? And so, name the actor category and then what you hope they might do, if that's okay. Jen, maybe I'll turn to you first.
We have sort of a standard answer to that in the sense of we have to update the operating model of government, bring it in, sort of leapfrog it since we sort of missed the internet era into the AI era, which is challenging because we don't really know what that's going to look like. And that is 4 parts. Sorry, you said one, but I can't pick one. If you want government that can achieve its policy goals, you have to have the right people, so we need to do civil service reform. They need to be focused on the right work, so we have to do lots of different kinds of procedural reform, including APA, which is key to how government listens. They need purpose-fit systems, so we have to change how we build and buy technology, and they need to be able to operate in test and learn frameworks, which means we need to reinvent oversight and the relationship between the executive and legislative branches.
So who's your most important category of actor that you want to have do their business differently? You only get one.
Congress.
Congress, okay. Julius, how about you? What's your intervention point to get us out of the vicious circle, get us to the virtuous circle, and your one category of actor that's most important to you?
I might take a step back here.
Oh, come on.
Well, no, I'm even more controversial at a place named for democracy. But I hear this democracy talk. It all sounds very romantic. It's kind of a Deus ex machina. I can't explain why something works. More democracy, or it's I can't provide another rationale for whatever I want to do, so I'll just call it more democracy. And I'm not sure that American history actually, the case of everyone's complaining about the media and the social media, and I share those complaints. I've seen the best minds of my generation destroyed by Twitter, and it seems to be even worse for older people. But you're not getting out of that, and you're not going to go back. If you want 1950s democratic comedy, you're going to have to go back to the 1950s media environment, and that's not going to happen. So I think we need a lot more realism. Neither side is really strong enough to control free speech or whatever euphemism you want to use for that. So you're going to have to figure out how to deal with long-term thinking within a political environment that, is superficially always going to be very fractured and very contested. Because I think actually a lot of the important things can and do happen, even though all the chaos is going on. You can actually just ignore most of it and it doesn't really matter. But it's, and that's what, basically you could describe political history, that's what in the neoliberal era we did this by shifting toward the Fed and transnational institutions, and those are no longer going to be adequate to the task for various reasons. So I think you have to find a model where you can actually accomplish state capacity while recognizing that the superficially democratic contestation is just going to be much more violent, hopefully not literally, but maybe, and just chaotic than these, romanticized versions of the past.
So, Jack, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to change my question up slightly since it's. All right, fine. Go for it then.
Why don't you ask me
Go
your
for it,
question?
then I'll ask you the other
I'll decide
question.
which one I like better.
You take this one, then I'll ask you the other one.
So I'll just say I basically agree with everything Julia said, and the downward cycles I think about are the weaponized presidency. I've been thinking about that for a long time. It did not begin in the second Trump turn. It's been happening, depending how far you go back, for a while. I don't know what the right actor is, but I do believe, I agree with everything Julia said about the communication environment, which I think makes all of these problems so much more difficult. I basically think, this is answering the question in a kind of sideways way, that until there's utter collapse by one side and utter victory by the other, such that there's a regime that is in which the president has massive control of Congress and I'm thinking something like in the 1930s, only in that circumstance, I think, can we possibly have context-shifting change, serious, fundamental, structural change. And then the question will be whether that regime will be virtuous or non-virtuous.
All right. Well, so let me challenge that actually then, and go back to one of the points you made earlier, Jack, where when I asked you about Congress, you said there's a lot of other things you'd have to change, how parties operate, primaries, et cetera. It strikes me that is another avenue. That is to say, we shouldn't accept that politics is just going to be chaotic and violent. It's chaotic and violent precisely because it's not actually channeling popular experience in effective ways. And if you can't channel popular experience in effective ways, well, then you shouldn't have democracy. It's just sort of very straightforward. So if you care about freedom, you have to care about channeling popular experience. And then it does seem to me that one has to pursue structural reform. There's not just the 30s, right? There's the progressive era coming in the wake of the Gilded Age, which achieved direct election of senators, achieved right to vote for women. So why can't we have that history as opposed to the collapse of one party and, fully unitary executive history?
Well, the progressive era, I'm not an expert on this, but it grew out of a rough period, and it responded to a rough period. And I don't disagree with what you just said. The question is, how do you achieve the conditions where you can accomplish that? And I think this is part of Julian's point, maybe not. It's wonderful to talk about all the nice reforms we could make to make Congress better, but how do you achieve the nice reforms that we can make to make Congress better given the current situation in Congress? And that's why I'm talking about, unless there is some major victory for one side, you're just not going to have the conditions to do that.
But I think a feature, each time we sort of, I think, look back, a feature of those moments was the sort of deep written rules that had allowed some people to participate in democracy and force other people out. And we talk about it so often like it was a bug, not actually the feature. And then when we try to advance forward, there is no time machine. As much as bad as things can feel right now, there's no time machine that I want to get out of and bring other black people or bring gay people to and get out the time machine and say, hey, we're here. It's just and so I do wonder, how do we make sense of these, looking at these moments where we think that we achieved such radical change, or these moments when the actual feature of those moments was that some people actually were able to participate and some people weren't, and that the sort of success of those moments from the economy, from the democracy, relied on people being in the room or not in the room. Some, and the thing I'll just say about even these conversations that I'm often in around technology and monopolies, and we talk about going back to an age where we were like breaking down monopolies, but we did have monopolies during those eras. We had all white monopolies. We had all male monopolies. They were monopolies. They just weren't written as monopolies in the same way. And I think that I think when we're not actually clear about those things, I think we sort of overlay, we hope for a future based on the past that is not a reality.
All righty, thank you. Jed, I'll give you the last word on this round of questions.
Yeah. So I haven't actually experienced anyone over the last 2 days as pining for an idealized reality that's gone. But I do think we needed Julius's cynical acid bath, and I mean that in a positive sense, actually at the beginning, because I completely agree that democracy is a word to conjure with and moralize with, as many of its critics have said, and that particularly on the left and center left, there is a habit of using the term democracy to mean anything that one thinks is good, that's hard to spell out more specifically or more persuasively. But I think what that makes us confront is exactly how hard this is and how hard this is now. That if our world were at a sort of time zero and we looked around at one another and asked, well, how are we going to do this? And we were offered democracy, people might say, nah, you can't do that. No way. So there is a sense in which we're talking about an institutional and ideological legacy that doesn't entirely make sense with or square up with our world. It's also true, as Yochai said in his wrap-up yesterday, that one of the natural tendencies of market society is toward oligarchy. A market society that tends toward oligarchy is better than a lot of other social equilibria, but democracy is the name for the only form of politics that has consistently and with some efficacy pressed back against that tendency, and I think that remains worth seeking not to recover, but to redeem.
And on that note, we will say thank you to our panel.